All right, should be recording now. Thank you so much for being here. This is our third Oklahoma Multi-Tiered System of Supports Community of Practice, presented by SPDIG, the State Personnel Development Grant. If you are looking for the last presentation, it is on our Canvas page, and then it is recorded with Dr. Brittany Stein. Yes, Dr. Brittany Stein. So today we have Stephanie Beasley from Bixby who will be presenting, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you so much, Madison. I am so glad to be here with everyone, sharing what we have learned with auditing our resources and organizing everything so that we can meet the needs of our students. Just to give you a little introduction about my role, I am a full-time school psychologist in the district, and I was asked to be our OTIS coach the second year that we were participating in the OTIS grant. And so that is one of the parts of my role is I serve as our district MTSS coach. So we were participants of the OTIS grant from 2019 to 2023. So it ended this spring, and we have gained so much information and expertise from Dr. Duhan, Dr. Stein, and Dr. Rich, and all of the students who are part of the OSU school psychology program that participated. So I have to thank them for all that they have taught us, and all of the coaching that we received was excellent from the State Department. So anyway, we will begin. I just want to say too, before we dive into talking about how we looked at our screeners and all of those things and auditing those resources, I want to say that our district, again, with guidance from the OTIS grant personnel, did a lot of that work of looking at what resources we had, that auditing process, that first year of the grant before we began a full site implementation. And that was important to do that to prepare for site implementation. But auditing our resources is something that we are consistently doing. So as we are looking at the next steps, because we know MTSS implementation is something you have to do in steps. It can't be done all at one time. So every year as we are implementing more, we need to go back and look at what do we have in the district. We, of course, began with academic implementation, but in year 3, we began to implement for behavior, and that involved looking at the resources like what school counselors, what community-based therapists that we have that are working in our schools, looking at those resources that we had and organizing those and determining how to best use those resources to meet our students' needs. So it's a continual process, definitely, with each step. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and I believe you will have access to the slides as well after the presentation is over. So the first objective, we're going to be looking at screening. And so I want to talk about the elementary level and the secondary level. We know that MTSS implementation looks different at secondary schools, so I want to talk specifically about that. And then we'll also look at follow-up diagnostic assessments, and I can talk some about when we determined that that was needed and our process of deciding on diagnostic assessments. And then really looking at the different types of resources and how to efficiently allocate those to match needs. And that's always the goal, is we need to determine what we have and how best to use that. And in my first year as the district coach was our first full year of site implementation. And it was really important as we were communicating to our staff to say, we are doing many of these things already. We were meeting as data teams and we were providing interventions. And so our first full year of site implementation, we really emphasized that this isn't a really huge change. This is fine-tuning and organizing many of the existing processes that we had. And so trying to help our staff see that we are trying to do things in a more efficient way, and make sure that we are allocating those resources in the best way possible. Okay. So we'll talk first about universal academic screening. So the first year of our district implementation, we were guided from the Otis grant personnel to develop a committee to select a universal screening tool. And that's how that first step of looking at resources and auditing them began. And that committee, I would say it's really important that you select a committee with varied professions and expertise. So it had district curriculum leaders as part of that committee, school psychologists, reading specialists, and teachers. And having at least those committee members, I think, was a really important step so that you had those differing perspectives, because we know that the things, and we've seen that in a screener, school psychologists are looking for maybe different characteristics in a screener than a teacher might look for, or even a district administrator. So having all of those voices as a part of that decision-making process was really valuable. So that was, and especially having that teacher voice. So as you are launching that new screener, if you are as a district are purchasing a new screener, having teachers who were able to voice their opinion and able to preview that was really important to help with buy-in. Okay. Now, the next thing, so that was our goal. As we looked at, and we were purchasing a new screener that first year, and some of that came about because of changes. We had been using Dibbles and there were some changes in that. And so we were already looking for a new screener. But we, some of the things that we had to consider, cost is definitely always a factor that you have to consider. The other factor that we were really looking at are those additional features that the screener would provide, such as, did it provide progress monitoring measures? Did it have links to intervention or suggested interventions or intervention libraries? Did it have, we were looking for something that had reading and math. We had only had a reading screener before. And so there were many features that we looked at when we were determining our academic screener. And then you also have to consider training, because with a new screener, you have that need to train your staff on administering the screener and the progress monitoring measures. And I think that we always recognize that you have to train on how to administer those new screeners, but also there must be time to train on how to utilize those results. So what we have found is after changing screeners, you have that lag of time. You're administering that screener, and everyone understands how to administer it and you get the results, but learning how to read those reports and how to use those results to plan intervention, that's another step, and it requires training your full data team who reviews students' data. So that's a really important thing. I think when we first, as a district, moved to a new screener, we chose FastBridge. And at that point, we sent our school psychologist to receive specified training on how to read those reports, how to determine that academic skill need, and how to identify an intervention. And that was such a valuable time that our district invested. And it was like one additional day of training. The Fastbridge had, trained teachers and instructional leaders in how to administer and how to read, but we spent an additional day with the trainer really honed in on how to read those reports and how to guide that data analysis in the data team meetings. So I would definitely recommend, if you're looking at, training for screeners, that you look at having some of your data leaders in your sites have that additional training or access to some of those resources so that they are really able to be equipped to guide your data teams as you're looking at those resources. Because again, those results, being able to apply them to match student needs is so important. Okay. Let's see. Okay, the next part is really talking about those barriers. And I think when we look at academic screening, it's going to be the same with many of these things. You're going to find that stakeholders have different priorities in what they're looking for. So whenever we are looking at screeners, or even, finding some issues with an existing screener, there are certain aspects that we find with teachers. How long it takes to administer the screener is a really important factor, and it can be a barrier with that screening. And it is definitely something that we respect as a district, because teachers say, it is, when the screener takes too long, it is impeding our instructional time. And so that is something that we definitely want to take into consideration, that time that is required. What we find is, our administrators, who are the leads of our data team meetings, our school psychologists, really are looking for screeners that have good, easy to read reports, so that in our data team meetings, we are able to quickly see what is the skill need, how does it identify an intervention, is that progress monitoring report simple and easy to read and decipher. So those are some of the things that those leaders of the data team meetings, or the school psychs and instructional coaches who are guiding that interpretation of data, they are looking for different aspects and have different priorities in what they're looking for in the screener. So sometimes trying to take into consideration all of those factors and find the best screener is a challenge. And then again, you must dedicate the time to that instructional time to screen students. And of course, we were doing the reading screening. As we added math, and then moving that screening up throughout the grade levels, that has been something that we are constantly having to explain the importance. This is important data, and we're using that to meet students' needs. So explaining that to teachers, to all of our teams, that's been important for us to continue to revisit that. Okay. So as I was talking about those academic screeners, that process has been primarily K through 6th grade that we have been implementing that at level of universal academic screening. But with the OTIS grant, we began screening our middle school students as well. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next, is the difference in secondary MTSS implementation. So we know, again, school looks different, MTSS and data review looks different, but the goals are very similar. We want to identify the students who are at risk, who have an academic skill need, and we want to be able to implement intervention and address those needs. So it's going to be similar goals, even though it does look different. And we have now at Bixby, and this is our first year, to have a daily intervention time at all grade levels. So we have a dedicated advisory time at the middle school that we've had for a few years, and now at the high school we do as well. And what we are, again, this is our first year of having a daily intervention time at the high school. So we are still in the process of determining how to assign students to that. And it will be a process that I'm sure we will fine tune each year, but always we're going back to our data and looking to see which students require intervention. So that's an important goal. So in our middle school, which is grades 7 and 8, we had purchased FastBridge originally in 2020, and we were finding that teachers were not really seeing the value of the FastBridge results. And that has been kind of a constant conversation with our middle school teams. And again, they are wanting to use, if they're taking the time to do this academic screening, they want it to be valuable and to inform their instruction. And a few years ago, we had a request because they were utilizing IXL for instructional purposes to use IXL as a screener. And so that was, I think, an important thing to address their concerns, to see that they were asking for a screener that would have that instructional value. And so it's been, I think, a really good move for us, for our middle school teams. This instructional, using that for instruction is very important. And so I think that was almost like a compromise that we made as we were listening to what teachers were asking for in the teams at the middle school, and also, looking at what our goals were for MTSS implementation. So at the high school, we did not purchase a universal screener that would assess reading and math skills. So what we do is what is recommended by many MTSS leaders. We use some of those early warning system indicators. Grades, credit deficiency, behavior are the main sources of data that we're using to identify students who need intervention or who are at risk. Attendance, we know, is another important factor, and we plan to add that in as one of our sources of data. But as I'll talk about in a minute, that the amount of data at the high school, and that is definitely a barrier in trying to work through how to organize all of that. Okay. So the barriers to academic screening in secondary. I mentioned this a little bit before, but finding a screener that teachers really see the value in is an important thing that we have learned as we were auditing all of our resources and selecting a screener. So it was important that we find a screener that teachers can utilize. Another thing that we're finding is it's more valuable for an English teacher to be administering the reading screener. And that seems kind of common sense, but we were having students who were in different advisory groups do their screeners. Well, an art teacher maybe didn't have that same level of investment in the results from a reading screener as an English teacher did. And so just a couple of those things we have learned through our experience, that tying that screener as much as possible to the Tier 1 instruction is a really important it's an important thing to consider when you're looking at how you are going to be even just administering that screener. So in the high school level, when we're using things like grades, credit deficiency, behavior, attendance, gathering and organizing that data is really a large task. And it does require dedicated personnel or systems. And that is something we are still in the process at the high school of determining the best and most efficient way to do that. We always want to look at the existing resources that we have, the existing personnel. I know one of our coaches through the Otis grant, asked, do you have a high school teacher who is just really into data and just really enjoys that? That might be a person that you could task with helping organize that. And so we have an educational technology team, different people like that we are looking at for using and helping us with organizing that data. So we're definitely trying to use the resources that we have already in our district. Okay. Now, diagnostic assessments was the second part that I wanted to address just kind of quickly. The goals are very similar, but we want to be able to hone in on those specific skills. Sometimes the screener doesn't identify the specific skills that are at need. And so we need that diagnostic assessment. So when there were some changes to required reading screenings with the dyslexia assessment. And so we did change our screener to a mirror. And after doing that, we realized we needed to obtain some more specific diagnostic information to be able to guide intervention. And so that was a process where we had already selected a screener, and then we saw that there was a need. And we met as a team and developed some additional diagnostic screeners or assessments that would be administered to specific students who we needed additional information. And so that was important to be able to recognize when there's a need and determine a way to address that. So, and the barriers to those diagnostic assessments are very similar to the barriers with the universal screeners. Again, you're looking at time, you're looking at different priorities for what you're looking for in those diagnostic assessments. Okay, I want to talk about our intervention library next. So matching your intervention, your academic need to intervention is so key in being able to have a healthy and a strong MTSS system. So one of our first steps was really to create a committee to look at all of our existing reading interventions is where we began. And so we started with a very similar committee as the one that developed or that determined our screener. We used reading specialists, school psychs, and our instructional leaders to be able to gather all of those existing reading interventions. What we found is we had a whole lot of reading interventions, and we next decided to really use our screening tool and use those specific interventions that were being recommended. So if you have an academic screener that suggests interventions, definitely invest in developing those as part of your intervention library. If there are solid evidence-based interventions, that is a great way to use that resource. Or even matching, the terminology. So whatever the identified skill need is on that screener, make sure that your intervention library is matching that. Just as much as you can, make that intervention library easy to access for your teachers and your instructional leaders. I recommend doing that for sure. We keep our intervention library on a staff hub, so everyone is not having to dig through a drive or find it somewhere. We try to keep it very easily accessible for all of our staff. Another new thing that we have begun this year is having a periodic intervention training as part of our professional learning community time. And so we have just a set day I believe it's every 6 weeks that we're going to highlight a specific intervention and have training dedicated during that PLC time. So I also recommend that. That's been very important to dedicate that time to train teachers. And it does not take long to train on one intervention. And so we have set aside that time so that we can do that and make it specific for elementary, has specific interventions, and intermediate others. So here's an example of what our intervention library looks like. And again, we are streamlining it. One of the things I think that is important, we had a lot, and we still do have a lot of reading interventions in our library. And I remember Dr. Duhan saying that's too many. Your teachers will be overwhelmed. And many people in the district, our leadership thought, let's have all of them in one place. Let's make sure we have plenty of resources available. But we began hearing from teachers there was too much. It was overwhelming. And so we have gone to having one or two as the first intervention to implement. So if it is a fluency need, we have one or two interventions for a teacher to select. We have a backup bank that is more extensive that our instructional coaches, school psychs, principals, everyone, of course, has access to. So if one of those two interventions we're not seeing growth, we will pull from that larger bank. But it really is important. Teachers don't have enough time to go through all the different interventions when you have 15 for fluency and select one. So we found that is the most efficient way for us to provide interventions through that bank. And here's an example of one of our reading intervention slides. So we have a demo video and then the materials all in the protocol linked in there so that teachers can access that and have everything they need in one place. So definitely the main barrier to this academic intervention library is the time commitment. It has taken a lot of man hours to go through those interventions and really determine those one or two that we want to have as the first intervention for each of the skill needs. Developing a standard protocol, that is something our instructional coach team worked on, is being able to identify a common standard protocol. And then even developing the paper materials, because we know that when you're implementing the intervention, having those all of the materials right there handy is important. So our instructional team has worked on that as well. So there's just, again, extensive time commitment, creating all of the materials, the videos, and then training the staff. And I think just another barrier has been those differing philosophies when you're looking at prescribing intervention. So many of our teachers and instructional leaders don't want to be too prescriptive and tell teachers exactly what to do. They want to allow teachers to have that autonomy to select the intervention that they believe is going to be most effective. And so I think that is something that our district is always trying to determine the right avenue. And certainly we want to respect the teacher's expertise and autonomy, but also having being sure that teachers are using evidence-based interventions. And so we really, again, are providing this intervention bank with vetted evidence-based interventions, and then trying to allow some choice for teachers to select from a couple in that bank, and then our instructional coaches, what we found is that we rely on them to be an expert. So if the teacher says, I would like to do this other intervention that's not a part of the bank, that instructional coach would review that and ensure that it is an evidence-based intervention. Okay, so with the secondary interventions, I'm sharing a pyramid that the State Department has shared that was really such a good starting point for us at the high school in particular. That's one of my sites as a school psychologist. And whenever we were looking at implementation of MTSS at the secondary level, my teams were, I think, overwhelmed. And so I brought this pyramid in and just sat with them and said, what do we have for tier 1, for tier 2, for tier 3? So filling this out as a team, as our leadership team, was a really important first step for us with auditing our interventions. And as we did this, it really helped us see that we had more than we realized. And so determining what we have and then assigning students to that intervention, that really was our first step. And we keep this pyramid, which it has actually, we've changed it and added more to it, but we keep that handy as we are in our data review teams and talking through students, because it is such a good reminder of, oh yes, remember that intervention would be a good one to address this skill need. So I would definitely recommend doing that at your secondary levels. That was really helpful. Okay, and so behavior, I will talk just a little bit about how we screen and implement interventions for behavior. This is a newer part of our MTSS implementation. And the goal for universal screening for behavior is, again, like the goal for screening for academics. We want to identify social, emotional, or behavioral needs, students who need that additional support. We also want to be able to guide teams on selecting those evidence-based interventions. And we also are really right now trying to determine efficient ways to monitor that intervention to see if it has been effective, and to intensify support based on data. So the first step with behavior was developing what is our behavior curriculum, our tier 1 curriculum, because just like academics, we have to teach behavior. Dr. Duhan definitely taught that to us that in our first year, really looking at, okay, we expect students we teach students all that they need to know about reading and math. Well, we must also teach students what they need for behavior. And so we first developed a common expectation and procedure list or matrix. For elementary and intermediate has one, and then our secondary students also have a separate one that are more age appropriate for secondary students. And these are the expectations that teachers teach at the beginning of the year and throughout the year after Christmas break and those times whenever students are needing reminders of what the expected behaviors are. So this is our curriculum. We also, of course, have classroom management, and we use great expectations as part of our school climate, and conscious discipline with our younger grade levels, that all are providing that tier 1 instruction on behavior. The next step for screening for behavior is to identify those students that are at risk. So if a student is having a behavior need, how do we know that? So the next step we developed was identifying major and minor behavior problems. And so our district leadership team met with principals to hammer out a list of minor behaviors and major behaviors that would be used with all of our office discipline referrals. So this is, again, a common list that everyone uses, and it's how we are identifying those students who have a behavior. We set specific criteria that if a student has 2 or 3 majors within 2 months, that they are a tier 2 student. They also could have 6 or 7 minors. And so we identified that those numbers as that's our cutoff score, our decision rule for when a student is moving into tier 2 and requiring tier 2 intervention. And then we identified tier 3. And again, that was important for us to develop those cutoff scores, those numbers, just like we use the 10th percent and below as our tier 3 for academic screeners. So this is our behavior screeners cutoffs. And then the last step, and again, we're definitely in the process of training and implementation on this, is we developed a pyramid that would guide our guide our teams through these supports. And so Dr. Duhan helped with developing this, and we find that the visual of the pyramid has been so helpful as we're teaching our teams to go back to tier 1, ensure that students understand the expectations, have been taught exactly what is expected, that teachers are using good classroom management techniques and things like that before we look at providing that intervention in tier 2 and then moving up to tier 3. And this again is a process of training on this behavior pyramid. And one of the things, I'll move on to the next slide, some of those needs that we found, creating behavior expectation videos, purchasing things like the conscious discipline materials and things like that, that's part of that. But the main need with our screening and implementation with behavior is training staff. So training staff on how to teach that behavior expectation, so that tier 1, training staff on how to identify major and minor behaviors. And one of the things that we have done with our administrators is create behavior scenarios. You know, Johnny punches Sally in the face. Is that a major or minor? And giving those scenarios as checks to ensure that everyone is in agreement that's a major or that's a minor. And then we've asked them to do that with their staff as well. So ensuring that there is common understanding for what is a major and what is a minor. And then training staff on how to enter in our office discipline referral system those majors and minors, and the importance of that. And that is something just last month I addressed with our principals, just reminding them this is our screener for behavior. So if all teachers are not entering that, we don't have universal screening data on behavior. It is very important that we have consistent data collection with behavior, and that everyone is entering that so that we're able to look at which students need support and just tier 1 problem solving, which our Otis grant team last year really worked with us on using that data to determine, if you have a lot of behavior incidents at recess, you need to add some additional supervision at recess, or in the hallway between second and third period for the high school, or something like that. And so using that data to make decisions about even tier 1 supports is important. Okay. And so those barriers for screening for behavior, definitely that consistency is important. So there are some staff who really like to enter those office discipline referrals and some who do not. And so really, I think that's a consistent thing. Training staff and explaining that the importance of that is important, so that you get that consistent reporting and entering of that. And then I think gaining buy-in among staff is important and has been somewhat of a barrier. Definitely the older the students are, the more staff expect that students should know what is an expected behavior, and they are right in many ways, but trying to explain that in each class you should teach your expectations and your procedures so that students understand what is expected behavior in your class, even at the high school level. One thing that we often say to our teachers is that you will spend time on behavior, whether it's at the beginning to teach expectations, or if it's after a behavior issue has occurred and you're trying to respond to it. So it's much better to be preventative and to teach those expectations at the beginning. And then definitely there is a time commitment to provide training on behavior interventions, just like with all things. So, okay. So we have some discussion questions for you all to discuss with your team. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Duhan to kind of guide and facilitate this discussion and add anything else that I have left off.
That was amazing information, Stephanie. So for discussion questions, we're not going to split into groups. There's a few on. I see Little Axe, Ardmore, Amy. So there's just a few. So we're going to stay in one big group to discuss these. Feel free to unmute or type in the chat your answers. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think, I don't know if I've got my mic off, so if you can't hear me, I'll speak up a little bit. I think, we've got Ardmore and Little Axe here and two very different districts in terms of size. And I think that first question, who should be involved in these decisions and who should be on your team, there's going to be very different answers based upon those logistics. And Stephanie, why don't you talk a little bit about who were the sort of core decision makers and who were the personnel you included on that team in Bixby?
Okay, definitely. Yes, so I know that we have our district MTSS leadership team that is the first decision makers, and we have our superintendent, associate superintendent, assistant superintendent. We have all of our leadership that attend, and it's really important. It begins at the top, and they make those decisions, and there is that unified stance with, yes, this is what we are doing. We have our curriculum directors who are also on that team, and our counseling services coordinator. So we in Bixby have kind of delegated the academic side of MTSS to our curriculum directors, and then our behavior side of MTSS to our counseling services team. And so that's sort of how we have divided. And then I work with both of those administrators. So in a larger district, that's the way. But again, when we are making decisions and developing those committees, we always involve our site specialists. So even with creating that behavior pyramid, we involved a teacher. So we do use site counselors and teachers as we are developing. We want to have their voice on our teams as well.
One of the things I want to reflect based upon what Stephanie said is, who did they bring to the table? They brought expertise to the table. They brought people who could make decisions to the table. They brought people who controlled funding and time and resources to the table. And they brought people who could communicate the decisions back and forth throughout the district and throughout the personnel who needed to know. So, that's a lot. And in a larger district, you've got to really think through those questions. In a smaller district, some of the same people that are the decision makers and have the expertise are going to be also making those communications out to the site level. So it's important to have all those resources in place. Question 2 now?
Yeah. Okay, so how do you obtain more involvement from site administrators in the process of auditing and allocating resources?
So Stephanie, was there resistance or let's just say resistance, but sort of lack of involvement early on in the process, and how did you guys address that?
Yes, there was. And the first year of our grant was at the district level. So it was our district leadership creating some of these smaller committees, making the decisions about what were going to be our cutoff points for academic tier 2 and tier 3. What was going to be our data review process, who would be a part of those teams. All of that was decided by the district. And then we implemented at the site level. So that first year of site implementation definitely was the year that we were investing a lot of time and discussion with our site principals. So there were a lot of questions, and I think what I found was a lot of time was spent in even helping the administrators understand some of the vocabulary and the language that we use through MTSS, and helping them see you are doing many of these things. This is, again, organizing and streamlining many of the processes that we have in place, and making what you're doing more efficient. So those definitely were a lot of discussions that first year and even the year following. But what I believe that I have seen is that the more knowledge that our site principals have had, the more involved they are. So I can see the questions that they ask and the concerns that they have at this point is definitely they have just gained more of that knowledge and expertise, and they are able to be much more involved.
I'll say another thing that Bixby did, and Stephanie, correct me on this if you want, but they put MTSS on the agendas of these different meetings. It wasn't just happening in one isolated setting. The principals meetings, MTSS was brought up and discussed at the principals meeting. So when the principals got together, that was a topic of conversation that happened regularly. So it wasn't just an isolated silo over here on the side. It was, they started to talk about it in the different meetings at the different levels across the district.
Yes, definitely. It began with the principals meetings and having frequent times that I still drop in to principals meetings and will share like a BTSS, it's Bixby Tiered Student Supports, as my, like an agenda item. Here's an update. Here are the things to, to address in your data team meetings. Here are the newer maybe developments or things like that. So yes, it's a standing agenda item in our principals meetings, but also in our site council meetings, in our PLCs. So it is something we have incorporated, like in our PLC agenda. I'm sorry, the bell's ringing. In our agenda list, our MTSS is part of one of those topics that our PLC teams can select from when they're determining and developing their agendas. So we have worked to make it an ingrained part of all the things that we do.
Okay, so I want to give plenty of time for any of our participants to ask questions. So if you have questions for Stephanie or for Gary, please put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask those. see, I think a few of our participants are still locked. There we go. Okay, so now you should be able to unmute yourselves or put any questions in the chat if you have them. But we will continue on to our last discussion question. So Stephanie, how did you deal with team members' opinions about screeners and interventions differing or being at odds?
One of the things that I believe that our district does well is take time to listen to the different opinions and really try to value that input. And so we are really working to collaborate with all of the different team members. So there have been multiple times throughout my time of coaching that we have said, we need to schedule a separate meeting to hear from some of the team members at a site who are having concerns about something. And we will sit down, and it's typically our associate superintendent, I'm sorry, there's announcements, that are, and myself and the site principals who will sit down and hear those differing perspectives and opinions. And most of the time we will make some kind of adjustment after getting that input. So we really do work to hear, and sometimes it's, we hear your concerns, but this is important because of this reason, and then we explain.
That's great. I'm sure that's really helpful, just listening. Okay, we have a question from Emily Littleaxe. Would you be able to share your secondary expectations and procedures?
Yes, I think I can do that. I may have to just download a PDF, but yes, let me make myself a note to do that. I can send that to you, Madison.
Yes,
okay.
I can share with Emily. Sabra, I think you have a question. I see your hand is raised.
Good morning. I'm sorry for joining late. I've got a little bit of the respiratory crud that's been going around. But anyway, I do have a question. Stephanie, how do you at Bixby deal with, and it may not be a situation your district is in, but how do you deal with the high rate of turnover in staff and addressing training?
That is a really good question. And I know that we have, I feel like, new teachers all the time. So I'm not sure our turnover rate, but I do, I will say that one of the things Dr. Duhan has done a great job of advising us is that you must have an onboarding process. So part of our beginning of the school year professional development is training staff on our MTSS system. And so what we did for the first time this year is I attended the new teacher training along with our associate superintendent and our curriculum director. And the three of us presented, here are the basics of our MTSS. And you know, with new teacher training, we're training on a lot of things. So we said you will get more detailed training later, but here is the why that we do this. Here are the basics of what our academic data review process looks like, our behavior process. And yes, that's really important. And we will do that every year. So, and even to go back a step further, our superintendent team trains principals at their summer administrator training. So that starts there because we have new administrators and we have them often. We're growing so much. We're just adding so many. So that was something that we did in July. And then again in August, we did new teacher training. And then every site principal also trains, which we created a simple Google slide presentation that gives, these are the basics of our MTSS system. And I share that with all the principals. They do that at their beginning of the year training. So those new teachers are getting it from us in the specific new teacher training, but then they're also getting it with all of the staff from their principal at their site PD.
Would you be willing to share your outline for the onboarding process as well as maybe that slideshow, that PowerPoint? At this point, we really don't have time to start from scratch. We could share with our new teachers as well as our returning teachers at the beginning of the school year about our MTSS and our office discipline referral system and kind of an overview. But like you said, they're receiving all kinds of training in that couple of days, and it's very overwhelming. And so, especially with the high number of adjuncts and emergency certs that we have, sometimes it's difficult for them to even remember what we were talking about. So I would love to do refreshers and that. And Dr. Duhan, if you have the onboarding process that you developed, I would love if we could maybe receive a shared copy of that as well.
Sure. I think Stephanie, maybe you and I can get together and we can kind of lay out what you guys do. The other thing I'll say on that is they're on, and I think you shared this a little bit, but they've got an extensive website for their processes and practices, and they've done a super job of developing it and making sure that they use it regularly. So they not only onboard them, they refer them to the website, and that becomes the resources for the how-tos. They've done a good job of keeping people up to speed on it. So yeah, Stephanie and I'll try to get together and put get some resources out to you.
Thank you so much.
I was going to say, this is our first year. I feel like that we have been more thorough of that with that. So we'll see if that has been effective. But yes, we could write out an outline again of just when we presented or how we presented that. But definitely one thing Dr. Duhan has reminded me a lot, because there are times that I feel like I have explained this and presented this and everyone should know, but it does require repetition and keeping those resources easily accessible through our staff hub or wherever it is, so that teams can go back and review that if they have questions.
Amy has asked, how long has Bixby been in this process?
We began the Otis grant in 2019. So in August of 2019. So we had those 4 years of the Otis grant. We were doing parts definitely of MTSS throughout all the grade levels, but it definitely was a shift in making it a very streamlined, organized, or at least beginning that process of it being streamlined and organized, data review process and interventions and all of those things. So, and we are still in the process. I will definitely say we have made a lot of growth, and I think I feel like it's accurate, and Dr. Duhan, correct me if I'm wrong, but to say it's easier in elementary and then it's more difficult in secondary. So we've seen a lot of growth with elementary and intermediate, and then it's taking longer at those secondary levels.
Yeah, elementary is more flexible and easier to make changes. Secondary is a little bit more rigid in terms of scheduling and resource allocation, things like that. But Bixby did a super job, and I'll acknowledge that not only did they begin implementing it, we started working with them in 2019. That was through COVID. They got a lot of this done. So that was a huge challenge for them, and they just kept trucking. So they did a super job.
Okay. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. That is the end of our session today. Our next session will be on November 30th with Kim Hastings, and we will be going over standard treatment protocol. So super exciting. So everyone, please join us for that.